The scent of rot wafted over the bridge as the party approached. The aftermath of a battle. There were bodies, 3 or 4 from the looks of it. As Simon approached, it became clear they'd been lying out for some time. Scavengers had already begun their work, and now it seemed a different sort of scavenger had arrived. A small group of people in mismatched armor were crouched among the dead, picking through their pockets.
"Aren't they the ones from the gates?"
Shadowheart asked, nodding toward the scavengers. Simon nodded. He recognized the mop of hair on Aradin, the one who had been punched by Zevlor. Though Simon had initially been disappointed in his diplomatic failure, he rather thought the man deserved what he got. "I do think you're right," he said, glancing to the others before striding forward, his hands empty, but ready to snap to a defensive spell at the first hint of aggression. "Well met," Simon called. The scavengers immediately stood from their places, swiftly stowing their ill-gotten gains and reaching for their weapons almost by instinct. "Pardon me, but don't we know each other? At the Emerald Grove, right?" Simon asked. "We defended the gate together." "So we did," Aradin said, his gaze narrow and wary. "You fell in with the Foulbloods, didn't you?" "Rather more you ran afoul of them, as I recall," Simon replied. "I was merely trying to keep the peace while the blood ran hot. But I can't stop a man from responding when you use fighting words, especially if you're accusing an Elturellan Hellrider of cowardice. I can't imagine what you expected the outcome of that to be." "Well, sometimes the only way to settle things is like menfolk," Aradin scoffed. "Don't expect a ponce like yourself to know much about that." "I might know more than you think," Simon said, gesturing to the mark on his jaw from Lae'zel's fist. "I got my comeuppance earlier this morning for behaving like a right git myself. Looks like we've got something in common now." "So we have," Aradin replied, his expression still sternly guarded. "Are these your men?" Simon asked, gesturing to the fallen. Simon's hand rose to clasp the locket around his neck as he watched the others return to picking through the pockets and packs of their fallen comrades. "Were. Couple new recruits, too. We all signed on to the same job, looking for the Night Song." "Beg pardon?" "The Night Song," Aradin replied. "Some sort of relic. A wizard back in Baldur's Gate were looking for it. Name of Lorroakan." "Oh. Well, if Lorroakan is looking for it, it must be something to help with the washing and drying," Simon chuckled. "You laugh. He was going to pay good money for it. Solid silver. Enough that even were we to split it, we'd be set for life. That's why my crew were willing to take on a few extra hands. Fat lot of good it did us. Only 3 alive. The druid would come with us captured, and nothing to show for none of it, except to bring keepsakes home for the families." "Yes, I expect that coin purse was quite the heirloom," Astarion remarked, his gaze falling to Aradin's pocket. His face darkened in anger. "Oi! Who asked you?" "Oh no, don't misunderstand. I'm all for taking from the dead. It's not like these poor sots need what's in their pockets anymore. It might as well serve those of us who are still up and about," Astarion said, skillfully avoiding ever claiming to be alive. "Barely even stealing, as far as I'm concerned. Are you taking that?" he asked, pointing to a hand crossbow still hanging from the dead man's belt. "You took the first druid with you," Simon continued, trying to rein in the conversation once again. "I was told you went west in search of a source of some strange infections," Simon said with a moment's consideration of how much truth to reveal. "You weren't seeking similar answers?" "No. We was told the relic was beneath an old temple out here. Heard there was some goblins around, and with as many hands as we had, figured there was nothing to worry about. Druid said he had his own reasons for going, but we knew where the temple was. We turn up, the place is crawling with gobbles. A whole damned army. And I don't just mean numbers, I mean supplies. Commanders, the lot. It weren't right, so we got the hells out, but not before we were spotted. You wizard types are supposed to be clever. Reckon you can figure out the rest from there," Aradin growled. "Indeed," Simon nodded, glancing at the bodies laying about. "We're headed back to the gate. You'd be wise to do the same, Aradin said, his tone grim. Breaking off the search, then? Coin at any use if you're too cold to spend it, Aradin said. I don't suppose you have a map of the area by any chance? Simon asked. Had one. Brian held onto it like it was his own todger. Goblins made quick of the fat old chunk, Aradin replied. All I got's the contract. It's got a sketch of the area, but nothing like what we had. That's fine, we'll take what we can get, Simon said, his tone carrying the confidence of a commander. Aradin shook his head in disbelief. Well, if you're looking to meet Kelemvor, I'll not stop you, he said, reaching into his pack and pulling out a crumpled handbill. Though if you do find it and live, maybe don't forget to cut us in, eh? We shall see, Simon replied, accepting the page. Our primary goal is finding the druid, but if we happen to pick up a relic on the way, I'll remember you. But before we go, shall we give rites and say a prayer for the fallen? What sort of prayer? Aradin asked, eyes narrowed. I spent my youth as an acolyte in the local temple back home, caring for the dead and dying. It was to teach me humility, I think, Simon remarked. But I found it very fulfilling. Simon felt his hand drift toward his ritual dagger almost automatically, and knelt by the dead man nearest them. He wasn't sure if a funerary rite would actually accomplish anything. These people had died days ago. Their souls would have already been judged by Kelemvor, and if their gods had any care whatsoever, they would have been claimed by now. Still, there was a chance at being unclaimed, wasn't there? His sacrifices lately had been so paltry, and none of them had been sent to him yet. He needed something bigger, something to stave off his hunger. Lost ones, may you now see the path between the stars, he murmured, cutting a shallow slit across the dead man's forehead like an eyelid. O my lord, fix your gaze upon these ones, that you may know them, have known them, will know them, and let them become part of you. Simon let out what sounded like a long sigh, mourning the senseless loss of so many lives. But Shadowheart's brow furrowed. She'd sat next to him in prayer for a few days now, listening to his deep breathing exercises during his sacrifices, and waiting to see if he would give a prophecy, and though he hadn't yet, she could swear she heard dark whispering in his long, steady exhales in the evening. She was even more certain she heard it now. Hark, O dark lord, open your yawning mouth, that these sacrifices might sustain you. May this energy grant you greater mass and hasten your glorious collapse, mass and gravity and gluttony eternal. Simon didn't feel anything, nothing channeling in either direction. They were far too late. Only these people's corpses could benefit his lord now, but he certainly couldn't sacrifice them here. He needed a permanent altar to properly feed a corpse to a dying star. He needed to get home. 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 Get home. Get home. Get home. Get home. Get home wrong. Get home wrong. Oi, get your necromancy off of him! One of the others, an archer, cried. Simon jerked himself back to the present, the hissing in his ear like a distant waterfall cutting itself silent. Now there was only the actual rushing waters of the stream beneath the bridge, rushing toward the Gianthar. Calm yourself, Simon said with the cool authority of a priest before his congregation, rising from his place. I'm no necromancer. No, not a necromancer indeed. A diviner, a prophet, one who had heard his God again. We're leaving, Aradin growled, his gaze flicking from Simon to Shadowheart, Lae'zel to Astarion. His uncertainty was palpable. don't follow, if you know what's good for you. Right, you lot, let's hit the road, he said to his companions, turning to head down the road, but never fully turning his back on Simon and the others. Then you're not taking this? Astarion called, retrieving the hand crossbow from the man's belt and testing the mechanism casually. Right, carry on then.
We should look into this relic, Shadowheart advised, taking a step forward. One of Lady Shaw's names is the Night Singer. Something called the Night Song must be connected.
Simon raised an intrigued brow and lifted his locket to his lips. Did you catch all of that? I did! A voice, Gale's, rang out from the locket, although with the tinniness of being heard from another room. This iteration's a real winner. We must not be distracted. We seek the creche, not some talisman, Lae'zel snapped.
If it is something that can draw the divine aid of my lady, then we might do well to seek it out, Shadowheart argued, nose in the air.
And at the very worst, Gale can consume it.
Astarion!
Shadowheart snapped. That is a very real potentiality, the voice from the locket replied. Just as long as we're very clear you are not eating this locket, I'd kill you with my bare hands, and I don't care how long it would take, Simon said in a playful tone that carried a worrying undercurrent of severity. I don't eat the objects. It's a vivid metaphor. I saw what you did to our prototypes, Gale, and you're not touching this locket again. I was nervous enough giving it to you this morning as is. May we move this along? I can only hear you. I can't see whatever map you've obtained. The map was a fine rendering of a crude original, most likely an elaboration on a much smaller section of an aging map to begin with. Many of the landmarks they had been using in recent days, like the smoldering wreckage of the Nautiloid and the Druid Grove, were, naturally, not on the map. Nor were many of the features they had since discovered, such as the Harper Watchtower, which had narrowly escaped being smashed to splinters and burned down by a crashing ship, or the toll house on the road, which had not escaped a similar fate at the hands of Karlach. It did show the low mountains they saw rising to the northeast, and nestled in a guarded valley was Aradin's doomed destination, a temple complex. According to the map, there should have also been a nearby village, as temples so often had, but so far no one had mentioned it, neither the druids nor the tieflings. Surely if it were near, they would have sought refuge and trade there. Seems our first task should be finding this village here, Moonhaven, or what's left of it, Simon remarked. Roads lead to villages. If we follow it long enough, we're bound to find something. Hopefully a tavern and a proper bed, Astarion said. I doubt it, Simon said, or the tieflings would have gone straight there as soon as Cogger started to bluster. Why keep up the confrontation unless there was nowhere else to go? Ugh. Of all the strips of riverfront on the Chiontha, we had to crash land on the most boring, Astarion whined. Even ruins are a landmark, Lae'zel stated, continuing down the road. We must scout the area. Oh, I can help with that, Simon said, twirling and pinching a bit of weave. Ex textura veniet juvame, he whispered with arcane intent. The air trembled in reply, glowing with the blues and greens that were Simon's arcane signature, and with a small pop, a tiny snake manifested in his palm, snub-nosed and silver. Everyone, say hello to Mortimer, Simon smiled, holding his hand out. The little serpent unhinged its jaw in a yawn and stretched two silver-white feathered wings, sparrow-like in shape and pattern.
That's strangely cute, Shadowheart smiled, leaning close. Hello, Mortimer.
He's not particularly clever, poor dear, but he can certainly look ahead for us, Simon said, holding his hand aloft and shaking Mortimer free from between his fingers. Mortimer flapped his little wings and flitted off into the sky, disappearing almost entirely against the clouds with his coloration. Go on, boy. Show me what you find, he called. I don't have particularly high hopes, but he does so like to help. Enough dawdling, Lae'zel declared, stepping over bodies to follow the dirt track once again. The road on the side of the river wasn't indicated on their rough map, and had clearly fallen into disuse. But the hard-packed earth had not grown fully wild just yet. Even without flagstone paving, it was still easily identifiable, and relatively easy to traverse. For a while, it didn't seem to lead anywhere in particular, just winding through peaceful woodland vistas and along a babbling stream. A well-worn game trail, Simon assumed. Soon, however, as they began climbing a rise, they realized they were climbing towards something. Town walls. Better late than never, I suppose, Astarion sighed, looking disdainfully at the wall several miles away from where the map seemed to indicate. It's a wonder that Git and his men found this temple at all, for all the good that map is. A tiny ribbon of silver flitted and floated through the dappled sun towards them as Mortimer returned, landing inelegantly in Simon's hand. His mouth was wrapped around a rather large spider, weighing him down. "Did you see anything, Mortimer?" Simon asked, holding the little creature up to his face. Mortimer worked his jaws against his prey, looking incredibly pleased. "Yes, I see your spider. Well done," Simon praised, with the tone of a patient but tired parent. "Did you see anything else?" "You already said spider. Do you remember what I sent you to do?" "I'm not mad, no. Please go back again and tell us what you see, and please do not get distracted." Mortimer closed his mouth around the last of the spider's legs before spreading his tiny wings and slithering out of Simon's hand, flitting up over the wall again.
"For a village, it's awfully quiet," Shadowheart said, "and vermin are up and about during the day. This place must have been abandoned long ago."
"Perfect place for an ambush," Astarion added, reaching for his bow. "It doesn't look like there's a clear way around," Simon remarked, "aside from other game trails or swimming upriver." "Then let us proceed, ready for combat," Lae'zel declared, drawing her sword and marching towards the village gate. The sign at the gate welcoming visitors to Moonhaven was badly battered by the seasons. Or rather, probably badly battered by one long season in particular, Simon thought, his gaze flicking across the dilapidated homes. The upper floors generally seemed all right, but the chaos at ground level and the high watermarks on the sides of the buildings told him all he needed to know. The Second Sundering. The Great Rain. When he'd mentioned so offhandedly to the others yesterday that he had prophesied the Second Sundering, he hadn't detailed precisely what that had entailed. A 10-day-long torrent of horrifying fortunes, visions of upheaval of the earth below and torn skies above, of famine and floods which killed just as surely as the spell-plague fires had before. A year of rain refilling the sea of fallen stars, and drowning the cities that had grown along the new shoreline, washing away both fields of wheat and fields of war with equal indifference. Of course. Even the fraction of that rain that fell on the far side of the mountains would have downriver effects. Some of the screams he'd heard must have belonged to this village. He raised his hand as they stood at the village gate, stroking a finger across the threads of fate, the unfinished edges of the tapestry where they stood. The prophesied events were long past. Here fate was malleable once again. He pushed against the thread, away from the image of bold Lae'zel pierced through the neck with a goblin's black-fletched arrow. It was a strong possibility, but not a desirable one. "Wait," Lae'zel said, now able to catch sight of a more corporeal thread strung across the road. A tripwire for an alarm. "Astarion was right," she said, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper, her gaze flicking across the nearby buildings for where ambushers might be lurking. "This is a trap." "It's also the way we must go," Simon whispered, gesturing to their crude map. "If there are any other roads, we don't know them. The goblins will." Shadowheart stared down at the tiny map, brows furrowed.
"Perhaps if we look for a weak point in the wall."
A waft of cherry and sulphur caught on the wind a mere moment before the form of a man burst into view in a shower of sparks, as though his noble form were cast iron knocked into being out of a great heavenly forge's mold. He was tall and broad-shouldered, as handsomely built as a man had any right to be. His swarthy face seemed to have been carved from stone to embody the meaning of disdain. The narrowness of his lips, the disapproving curve of his nose, the curl of his hair around his ears, the angle of his dark eyes looking around in judgment. He was dressed in the absolute peak of Baldurian fashion, with rich dark silk brocades and gold bobbin lace trim. Likely the reason Simon's tailor had such a hard time getting hold of any recently. My, what manner of place is this? A path to redemption, or a road to damnation? He asked, his voice booming with the theatrical timbre of the aristocracy addressing the masses. Hard to say, for your journey is just beginning. Before any could urge his silence or warn him of the potential ambush, an arrow was fired from the top floor of one of the dilapidated houses, its black fletches rippling. The dark-haired stranger raised a finger in a familiar, silent casting gesture, and the arrow crushed itself to cinders and ash against his shield. The vermin are troublesome. I'm reminded of the words of an old lullaby. The mouse smiled brightly. It outfoxed the cat. Then down came the claw. The stranger snapped his fingers, and pillars of fire erupted across rooftops, between buildings, out of windows. The panicked cries of goblins and screaming howls of wargs filled the air along with the rolling, greasy black smoke of burning, living flesh. One goblin flung himself from the rooftop trying to escape the blaze. An immolating bugbear ran in sheer panic for the nearby stream, the flesh of his limbs melting away to charred bone as he fled. The chaos and suffering lasted only a few moments, before uneasy silence and the residual crackle of the flames reigned. And that, love, was that. The stranger smirked, lowering his hand. You do know how to write them in Cormyr, don't you? He asked casually, his puckish brown eyes boring straight into Simon. Simon wasn't often struck dumb. Part of his aristocratic upbringing was the art of conversation. He'd often been drilled on this courtly matter by his aged governess, by having to take her arm and walk her through the rose garden, and choosing a new topic of conversation for every bush they passed. He'd been cuffed on the ear for insisting that the outer hedge counted as one. Now his ears were ringing just as much as if he'd been cuffed again, staring in shock and awe at the man before him. To cast so effortlessly, to cast without speaking. Even at apogee on high holy days, Simon did not wield that sort of power. No high priest ever had, not even Roland. Speak, boy. I know my accent is similar, but I'm not from Cormyr, Simon said, unable to completely suppress the tremble in his voice as he fell back to his training of inoffensive small talk. So 6 generations is what it takes to go from Cormyran to Dalefolk, the stranger mused, chuckling to himself. Well met. I am Raphael, he said, offering an elegant and well-practiced courtly bow. Very much at your service. And I am Simon Whitelily, though I'm sure somehow you already knew that, Simon said, watching the man warily. Of course, but you know the importance of a proper introduction. Now that we know one another, we really should have a chat. But, quaint as this town is, Raphael said, gesturing to the lingering wisps of smoke, a middle-of-nowhere village really is beneath our standards now, isn't it? Come. No incantation, no gesture, just a blinding flash. When his vision cleared, Simon found himself standing in a lavishly appointed obsidian and gold dining hall before an enormous, roaring fireplace, the stone inside blackened from use. The scent of spices and savory meats filled the air, wafting from an octagonal dining table behind them, piled high with all manner of fine foods. Roasted boar's head stuffed with sweet, seasoned apples, table grapes fit to burst with luscious, juicy flesh, delicate quails with the skins perfectly crisped, blackberry pies with elaborate pastry-wreathed tops encrusted with crystallized sugar, goat cheese and truffle salads with ripe cranberries, foie gras and duck jus, a goblet of warm blood. "What the hell's?" Familiar voices called out. Simon's attention snapped up and he found he wasn't alone. All 7 of them, even those back at camp, had been transported to this hall, red gold light pouring in through high stained glass windows, 12-foot portraits all around. "There we are. A little more up to snuff," Raphael smirked. "Where are we?" Will asked, immediately on edge. "Middle of somewhere." "Middle of somewhere?" Karlach repeated, narrowing her gaze. "More precisely, you are in the House of Hope, where the tired come to rest and the famished come to feed. Lavishly," he added, gesturing to the heavy-laden table behind them. "Go on, partake, enjoy your supper. After all, it might just be your last," he smirked. "I'm terribly sorry, but that sounded like a threat," Will said, standing up straight. His rapier remained at his side, but he stood ready to draw. "Merely an observation. Threats are for those who can't get what they want," Raphael said, his gaze flicking from Will to Karlach, who looked ready to explode. "You! Take us back right now!" she snarled, steam rolling steadily from her exhaust. There was none of the heavy chugging or blue-black choking smoke they'd grown accustomed to over the past few days. It was running smoothly, purring away in her chest like a panther. For her engine to be operating at peak efficiency, they could only be in one place. Avernus. "Tut, tut, and deprive you of my hospitality?" Raphael asked. "So you've already said there's something you wish to discuss with us," Simon said, unsticking his tongue and remembering his manners. He was speaking to a caster of indescribable power, after all, and in the man's own home, it seemed. A modicum of respect could go a long way. "And you know we don't have much time. I hate to be thought rude, but if we could please move on to business," he asked, taking a half-step to interpose himself between Karlach and Raphael. Not that it would do much good should either of them decide to attack. "Very well. Let's move on to business," Raphael said. A pillar of flame engulfed him for a moment, and when it flickered out, a far truer form was revealed, nearly 8 feet tall, a crown of horns, powerful wings, skin as red as Karlach's, but still smirking smugly, his countenance unchanged. "That certainly explains a lot," Simon thought, his voice rippling to the other's tadpoles. "What's better than a devil you don't know? A devil you do," Raphael smirked, flexing his new wings slightly for dramatic flair. "Am I a friend? Potentially. An adversary? Conceivably. But a savior? That's for certain." "And why would a Cambion come down from your lofty tower to save us?" Karlach asked. "Are you coming up short in your recruitment numbers?" "Oh, my dear, no. My compassion is boundless. I stride among the needy, giving comfort where I can. And you're all in dire need. One skull, two tenants, and no solution in sight. I could fix it all like that. You must be madder than a box of frogs if you think I'll take a deal with the devil, Simon said, feeling Will and Karlach swell with pride nearby. You, of all people in this room, would truly know madness best, wouldn't you? I'm surprised you can hold any thoughts in that head of yours at all, between the cheesecloth your so-called god made of your brain and the tadpole nibbling away at what's left. I have a feeling it won't be long before you change your mind, or it will be changed for you. But by all means, try to cure yourself. Shop around, beg, borrow, and steal. Exhaust every possibility until none are left. And when hope has been whittled down to the very marrow of despair, that's when you'll come knocking on my door. Hope. Ha! Such a tease. Raphael cackled, tossing his head and gesticulating grandly. And in the unlikely event that we happen to lose old Hope, how are we to find you again? Simon asked, hoping he was at least reading from the same libretto as Raphael. I'll be around, watching you squirm like a tadpole through a nice, juicy brain. Speaking of which, all those pretty little symptoms, sundering skin, dissolving guts, they haven't manifested yet, have they? One might say you're a paragon of luck. But will that luck hold out long enough to save, say, your fiery friend there? He asked, smirking and nodding at Karlach. Her engine works just fine here, but back in Faerun, well, you'll be counting the hours to death rather than the days. Or your spare wizard, being slowly devoured by his own folly, disaster always just moments away if he can't choke down some magic boot. And don't even get me started on your parasitic paramour. Raphael chuckled, quirking a brow in Astarion's direction. How long do you think he can control that appetite of his? Either of them. You have a lot of plates spinning. How many will fall before you come crawling to me, your hands and knees full of porcelain shards? With a scintillating flash, Simon found himself and the others back on terra firma, back to Moonhaven's hauntingly empty street. The sickly sweet scent of burnt goblin flesh cloyingly clung to the quiet breeze. God's damn it! Karlach roared, her engine flaring up as she slammed her fists into the rotted frame of a nearby house. I've had enough of these damn devils fucking with my life! Karlach, please. Your heart, Will warned, his gaze flicking between her face and her chest. The engine was flaring bright. Dark smoke once again rose in thin wisps from her exhaust. It wasn't just anger that had her grinding her teeth so hard they might break, but the full body shock of pain returning. Hellfire had soothed it for a few moments, but now... I hate to say it, but Raphael is right. If we want to keep everyone alive long enough to reach the creche and be purified, we need to take care of Karlach and Gale, Simon said, looking apologetically to Lae'zel for a moment. Lae'zel's lip curled in frustration. Perhaps they would travel faster if they were fewer in number, but she kept this opinion to herself. They may travel faster, but she was beginning to understand their uses, and it seemed Simon would be unwilling to part with them. Her only other option was slitting his throat in the night and taking the relic, but that seemed extreme, and likely to get her hunted by the others. "Fine," she huffed. "What do we seek first?" "If we're taking votes again, I vote Karlach," Will said, looking at the black smoke still rolling from her exhaust ports. "I don't know much about artifice, but I don't like the look of this smoke." "Yeah, it doesn't feel great either, soldier," Karlach said. Even as she tried to calm down, the fire still seemed to burn quite hot. "Let's try to quench that a bit, then," Simon suggested. "Right, let's find a well and see what we can draw up. We need infernal iron, right? I doubt we'll come across any here. This town's been abandoned for 5-6 years, but you never know. Search for the blacksmith. They'd have taken their tools before raw materials." "Excellent logic. But I think I'll head back to camp myself," Gale said, gesturing to his chest. "Best not to strain this. Oh, but before I go, have any of you got any earrings I can borrow?"
"What, looking to eat those too?" Shadowheart asked.
No, I need mundane jewelry currently on your person," Gale replied. "Yeah, sure," Karlach said, unhooking a pair of large gold-capped fangs dangling from her earlobes and dropping them in Gale's hand. "Damn. Feels weird not having them hanging about. Be gentle, I yanked those out of a Hezro's mouth myself. My first trophies." "Excellent," Gale grinned, carefully depositing the fangs in a leather pouch. "Anyone else?"
"Oh, fine,"
Shadowheart sighed, reaching up and pulling a pair of simple silver studs from her ears, almost entirely unseen given her fringe of hair.
"Don't lose track of them."
"We've got an expert on hand in case that happens," Gale grinned, clapping Simon on the shoulder and holding out the bag for Shadowheart to drop the earrings in. "Right, off I go. Oh, and do think of me if you come across any spare scrolls or other enchanted items, won't you?" Gale called, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a length of fine chalk and ritually etching a pattern onto a nearby mossy stone. The ribbon of silver flitted back into view, Mortimer once again crashing into Simon's arms, his tiny mouth once again filled with another large bug. Simon sighed. "Yes, thank you for warning about the ambush," Simon said, snapping his fingers. Mortimer disappeared from view in a shower of blue-green sparks, his prize mouthful of bluish legs left in Simon's hand.
"All right, fan out, everyone, and keep your wits about you. No telling if anyone is still left,"
Shadowheart advised, drawing her mace. The more they explored, the more they found the village to be eerily silent. The conflagration had driven off even the birds. All they heard was the crunch of grit beneath their boots and the rustle of wind in the trees. Doors stood open, some rotted away, some forced much more recently, with the upper floors stinking of brimstone and charred flesh.
"Dark Lady, preserve us,"
Shadowheart whispered, climbing to a crumbling second story and finding 2 goblins burnt to a crisp, another hanging halfway down through the hole in the roof where they had previously been stationed.
"Why have we drawn so much devilish attention all of a sudden?"
"Fear not. Our lords and ladies are with each of us," Simon said, resting a reassuring hand on her back and raising the other to cover his nose and mouth. His words were meant to comfort, but the greasy taste of the carnage slipped into his mouth as he spoke. It was all he could do to keep from coughing. He'd worked with the dead before, of course, for decades as high priest, conducting funeral rites, both for those who wished to be sent to the Lord and those who wished to return to the earth, and had attended funeral pyres before. The preparation, the herbs and oils and flowers burnt alongside, disguised the reality of hair and skin both crumbling into black ash, sloughing off of slick white bone, the fat of the marrow rendered out onto the surface, the way the bodies had tensed and curled.
"Shall we just assume that Raphael took care of everything at this point?"
Shadowheart said, looking back to Simon for a moment, concern on her brow. If he hadn't, what could have survived? "I think that's a fair assumption," Simon nodded.
Let's just look for infernal iron and get the hells out of here, Shadowheart said, beginning to poke around shelves and recently moved crates.
Do we really think we're going to find infernal iron here? In some person's abandoned house?
No telling how long the goblins have camped here. Things might be in all sorts of strange places.
Simon frowned and searched the room quickly, pulling open drawers until he pulled out a small ball of twine. He cut a short length and removed his signet ring from his hand, passing the cut twine through the ring 3 times with a quiet but intent whisper, before tying the twine to the ring and letting it dangle between his outstretched hands. Do I have dark hair? Do I have green eyes? Am I 12 meters tall? Is there another half-elf in the room with me? Where is she? He asked offhandedly, observing the swing of his makeshift pendulum for a moment and shaking it free between each question.
Ah, the glamorous work of a diviner,
Shadowheart smirked, though even she could admit she saw the difference in the swing, though his hands were stone steady. Right then. Is there infernal iron nearby? Simon asked, his gaze focused on the pendulum. It halted mid-swing as if caught by an invisible hand.
What does that mean?
Shadowheart asked, looking from Simon to the ring. It didn't even rotate freely. Inconclusive, Simon replied, a slight smile coming to his lips, which tells me there's something shielded from divination nearby. Whether there's infernal iron there or not, there's something someone doesn't want found.
Clever, Shadowheart smiled. Well, as Astarion said, let's take what the dead no longer need and get out of here.
Agreed, Simon said, slipping his ring back on and stuffing the twine in his pocket before returning to rifling through the drawers and shelves, pocketing anything that wasn't mildewy or crumbling from neglect. A whistle cut the air as Simon and Shadowheart carefully descended the rotting steps. They could make out the form of Will waving for attention through the broken windows of the ground floor. Over here, he stage-whispered as familiar figures began emerging from the rubble. We drew up the bucket and it was bone dry, but we heard water down there. So we dropped a torch and, well, see for yourself, Will said, gesturing down. Simon leaned over, carefully gripping the post beneath the winch. Sure enough, he could see the torch flickering on a damp stone surface, which clearly opened into a larger space. Caverns, carved by water. Makes sense. The Owlbear's cave wasn't that far from here. This whole region is probably covered in caves and sinkholes. We'll need to watch our step, even on ground floors, Simon remarked. So, we heading down there? Karlach asked. Give me one good reason why we should, Astarion huffed. Down a well's a good place to hide things, Will reasoned.
Probably not as many goblins,
Shadowheart added. A tactical approach to our next target, if the cave system is as extensive as Simon thinks, Lae'zel said. It looks wicked, Karlach grinned. All right. Astarion threw his hands up in frustration. We're not calling a session of Parliament for this one? He asked, frowning at Simon. I'm not crazy about climbing down a well either, but they're good points. Though I admit I think Lae'zel's is the most compelling, Simon added, leaning a little closer. I'm afraid I'm not going down there, Gale said, finishing his glyph with a flourish and watching it begin to light with his warm purple expression of the weave. Too much work to do. I understand, Simon said, tapping his locket again. And we've got this for now. I'll see you back at camp. What? Gale gets to just opt out? Astarion cried in disbelief. Can't I go? I need you here, Astarion, Simon replied, though he faltered after a moment. We need you here, he corrected quickly. None of us pick locks or take apart traps with nearly the steady hand you have, Simon added, giving what he hoped was seen as a flattering smile and not one desperately trying to cover a slip of the tongue. Astarion's expression was quick to change as well, gleefully picking up the ball and running in the opposite direction. Darling, If you want to spend more time with me, just ask, he smirked.
If you two are quite finished, Shadowheart huffed, someone needs to lower us down.
Don't know why you're looking to them, Karlach chuckled, taking up position at the winch. I've got your fringe. I think I'd best go too, Will said. Never know what we might find down there.
Fancy yourself a knight in shining armor? Shadowheart asked.
Well, I do try, Will smiled. Careful, Will. Shadowheart's armor's shinier than yours. Karlach grinned as the two of them set a foot each around the rim of the bucket and held onto the rope tightly. What if she needs to come save you? Then I'll be duly grateful. Everyone needs saving sometimes, Will smiled, though I try not to get into too much trouble.
Good plan.
Shadowheart smirked as the bucket descended, her voice echoing off the walls of the well.
Can't see myself happy to rescue you from some particularly stupid scenario.
Those at the top of the well watched as the torch was picked up and disappeared along with Shadowheart and Will into the depths. So, what now? Astarion asked, leaning against the side of the well. What am I so desperately needed for? Karlach, if you could wait up here to bring them up when they return, Simon suggested. Lae'zel and Astarion with me, if you please. Something around here is shielded from divination magic, and it might be what we seek. Ooh, lead lockboxes. Why didn't you say so? Astarion grinned. The first few homes and barns searched provided nothing useful. Nothing but flood-wrecked ground floors, rotted and looted by goblins. The apothecary's shop, however, had a cleverly hidden hatch leading to a suspiciously well-preserved ladder. Sure signs of magical protection. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have found our shield, Simon grinned, beginning to climb down. Oi! You guys aren't going to believe this, Karlach called, poking her head into the broken window of the shop. But Will and Shadowheart got back up on their own. Impressive upper body strength, Lae'zel remarked, stepping outside to find the other two emerging from a nearby building, covered in dust and cobwebs, but looking absolutely chuffed in spite of it. Simon said we're looking for a forge, right? Will asked, grinning. The basement of a nearby, thoroughly looted building contained two things: a well-loved and well-maintained forge, and a copious amount of cobwebs. The musty air hung thick between the strands of silk, weighing them down like a hag's stringy locks. The door must have been stuck tight, given that Will had apparently blasted his way through it to return to the surface. All the water that must have soaked into the wood warped it, Simon reasoned, sealing it more securely than even the finest padlock the masters of this forge could have crafted. Sunlight seeped into the space through a rotted section of floor above, the area crisscrossed with calcified cobwebs. Water had clearly done its damage here. Mold and mildew had taken hold just as much as everywhere else, and Simon could clearly see where the water had then taken its course on its way out. Various points in the wall had become weakened, and piles of moldy debris had been pulled to those places, including a rather new pile of broken stone and masonry.
When we saw light coming through the cracks, we got curious, Shadowheart explained, her mace covered in stone dust. Found ourselves here.
Excellent work, Shadowheart, Will. Simon grinned, giving each of them a light squeeze of the shoulder. We're the first to disturb this place in years. The soft sound of Astarion picking through the half-finished weapons and tools lying on the bench underscored his point. Right, if I were Infernal Iron, where would I be? Karlach mused, beginning to poke about as well.
How will we know Infernal Iron when we see it? Shadowheart asked, casually lifting the lid of a box, and only leaning back as spiders and other insects streamed out, their hiding place disturbed. You'll know it when you touch it, Karlach advised. Warm to the touch, and you'll hear the screams of the damned. Fabulous,
Shadowheart said, snapping her fingers and summoning fire to their tips to better illuminate the inside of her current crate. Lae'zel began climbing a rickety-looking old ladder, but the moment she put her full weight onto the rungs, the rotted wood gave way with a series of twisting, too soft cracks. The destruction seemed to move as though through molasses,
creaking and falling back to the brick floor with a hollow thunk.
"Shall I?"
Astarion smirked. He climbed on top of a nearby crate filled with mundane iron ingots and, cat-like, leaped to grasp the edge of the platform and the ladder had been leading to. Grunting, he struggled to pull himself up onto the platform once he found himself hanging. "Tusky," Lae'zel sighed, tossing the broken rung in her hand aside. She moved to crouch slightly beneath Astarion's dangling legs before standing, holding his feet firmly on her shoulders as she rose. "Do not expect this assistance again."
"Oh, well, that's much better,"
he said, much more easily hoisting himself with that barest advantage. There were a few barrels which seemed to have burst their sides when whatever had been inside became waterlogged, as well as a particularly secure-looking iron-banded chest. Astarion gave the whole thing a once-over before carefully picking the lock.
"I don't suppose any of you have a crowbar I can borrow for a moment?" he called, cautiously stepping back from his work.
Karlach picked up a pry bar from the workbench and casually tossed it onto the platform, landing with a heavy ring.
"The ease with which you do things like that truly disturbs me sometimes,"
Astarion said, moving to stand at the rear of the chest and prying it open from the lid's side. There was a soft creak as rusting hinges were made to move, almost covering the sound of a mechanism inside clicking. A tiny dart fired out from the barest opening, pinging off the stone wall.
"I like this one. Can we keep it?"
"Depends. Can those noodle arms lift it?" Karlach called, her tail swishing in playful anticipation. Pushing the lid back, it was clear that even with how well made the chest was, it was not impregnable. The lead-lined interior reeked of mildew and fungus. Astarion lifted out a rotting scabbard which fell away from an incredibly fashioned short sword, the gold inlay catching even the tiniest ray of sunlight with a cheerful gleam. Despite where it had been housed, it showed no signs of wear, not a single scratch or water spot. An oiled scroll case also sat inside, though it appeared stained. Astarion was pleased with the pop it made as he worked the cap off, finding the papers inside largely intact. He slid them out, unfurling what appeared to be a series of blueprints for some very fine weapons indeed. Precise arcs, clear lines, exact angles, all carefully described, along with forging instructions. One ingredient was crossed out with 3 sharp lines, while another was circled. Susur bark. A scrap of parchment fluttered out as well. Specimen, metal. Hardness 9.5, very hard. Melting point unknown. Color silver. Markings, red lacerations flecked with yellow dust. Underdark? Gift from unknown. Faintly sulfuric odor. Forging unsuccessful. Will not melt or warm at standard temperature. We'll go with the Susur bark for masterwork demonstration instead. Astarion didn't know what Susur bark was, but he suspected that the pile of crumbling detritus beneath a small colony of faintly glowing mushrooms could probably have been it once upon a time. Beside it was a hunk of silvery metal that looked as though it had belonged once to a breastplate torn asunder. He hesitated. He'd heard Karlach's description of the metal. Hear the screams of the damned? The echoes of his own screams sank into his bones so quickly that for a moment he wondered if he had, in fact, brushed the metal. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple handkerchief, picking up the oddly warm metal. "Catch," he called, heaving the chunk of metal down to Karlach. "Oh, yeah, that's the stuff. Right, let's get this back to Dammon at the Grove and see what he makes of it," she grinned, seemingly unbothered by the iron's more unusual properties. "Good work, Fangs." "Planning to help me down, too, Lae'zel?" Astarion asked, sitting and dangling his legs over the edge. "Presume such things at your own peril," Lae'zel huffed, turning and marching up the stairs, the others quickly falling in. Astarion included, and clearly needing no assistance in the climb down in spite of his complaints about having to do everything himself. And this was one distraction out of the way. Soon, she promised herself. But will it be soon enough?